Hello, and welcome to the Cosmic Tape Music Club podcast.
Hello.
This month we are covering Sun Ra. We are diving deep into the cosmos, into the myth, and finding out all that we can about his story and why he made the music he made and the people that he worked with in the Arkestra that he put together and carried with him for over 40 years.
And his synthesizers and keyboards and crazy electronic experiments.
Yes, he really embodies the spirit of our Cosmic Tape Music Club in terms of his philosophies and how he approached making music. And we had to dig, but we did find some examples of him using tape delay and synthesizers, obviously, and experimental approaches to sound. So I'm really excited to share what we've been learning.
And recording to cassette?
Lots of recording to cassette. I mean, he is of his time, so tape is always going to be a part of his story and his methods because that's what was being used at the time. The height of his career, tape was king, so it's no surprise that it's in the mix.
Certainly.
So I always like to start with a little background, give a little bio of what we've learned, where he comes from, what makes him the myth person that he was. He did say he wasn't human, he was a myth. I don't know if he ever specifically said that he was an alien. He said he was from Saturn, but that he was a myth, that he was here to tell the myth of who he
said that he wasn't human. He said what he wasn't. He didn't say what he was necessarily.
Yeah, that's another thing about Sun Ra is that in a lot of the interviews that we watched or read, he intentionally gave different answers all the time or would evade the question and talk about, some other philosophy that he was more interested in. But it was all part of maintaining this myth that he is unknowable. He doesn't have a birth date. Where is he from? He's from Saturn. He's from outer space. He's traveled the cosmos. And you can see sort of a glint in his eye and the joy that he gets from kind of messing with people, because there's these people going like, okay, when were you born? How long have you been doing this? When did you start? All these things. And he's just like, that's not what I'm here to talk about. That's not important at all.
He had a bit of a sense of humor about it. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I could just get that sense from him that he really enjoyed kind of throwing people off and telling them things that they weren't asking about and trying to lead them to the waters of new ideas.
Yeah, he was sort of like, oh, you're trying to get hot on my trail. Not going to happen.
Impossible. So he was, after his death, a biographer did kind of dig into his history to find out exactly when he was born and where he was born and his family life and all these things. Personally, I like to maintain the myth that he wanted to maintain. So I don't want to say, obviously it's very easy to find out his name and his birth date, but I don't want to say it on this podcast because he didn't want to be associated with those things.
Takes a little bit of the fun out of it.
And I don't want to perpetuate this, historical data that he did not associate himself with, right?
I'm in agreement with this philosophy.
I don't know why it really strikes me, and maybe, I feel that way about myself too, a little bit. So I relate to that, just protecting the myth that he, we're all self-created beings. We decide who we are and how we posture ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I want to respect that he, put a lot of work into that. And it was more important to him that we know this myth character. That was really important to him, that his message was heard. So I don't want to muddy the waters, even though that, Google it. It's very easy to find. But I do think it's important that he was born very early in the 20th century and in Birmingham, Alabama. I do think that those pieces of information are important because of the stories that he tells about his myth. And I think it's important to know the context and the time frame. I I don't know why I didn't put this together, but I was surprised at how early he was born,
Me too.
I was like, whoa.
I just started doing...
That is like time traveling.
I started doing the math immediately on like his age at certain parts of his career. And I was like, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, to realize that the majority of his career, like he really didn't start the orchestra until he was middle-aged. Mm-hmm. And he carried it for 40 years, so that's a part of life where people usually consider you're looking at retirement. You're not looking to start your career then. So I always appreciate that because it's never too late.
And I can certainly relate.
Yeah, it gave us hope. We're like, we still got a lot of time to, leave a legacy, because he did, make over 1,000 recordings.
Yeah. Individual recordings.
That we know of. I mean,
right.
There's plenty that he probably, no one ever
Not counting
had.
the demos.
Yeah, these are actual released singles, like pressed on his record label. We're getting way ahead of ourselves, but I will say that his mother was very supportive of his musical interests, and at a very young age, about 11 or 12, she bought him a piano. And, that's kind of the end of the story, really. He taught himself how to play. He taught himself how to read music. He would go to big band concerts and then come home and write down the arrangements of what he had heard. So, he didn't have any foundation in that. I think, his siblings and, there was music in the family. But he didn't have formal training. He didn't have any teachers. He just played. And it was just natural to him. Which blows my mind. But it does make sense because he truly is, he plays like no one else. You can find similarities to, other jazz pianists of the time, but he's pulling from a lot of influences. I'd say making his own sound.
He did most things like no one else.
That's true. It sounds like he very quickly learned how to play a variety of styles of what was popular at the time so that he could play events, he could accompany people. He was playing at clubs in a pretty young age. So he was playing all the styles of the time. And I think having that influence, having that kind of in your fingertips, and having to do it for events, having to do it professionally in a way, after a while, you've got all of these different rhythms and approaches that then you can form your own path, your own sound from that. But I think it's very hard to form your own sound if you don't actually know history, context, style.
Right. Well, it came from his philosophy about what music was to him, which was a language, a universal language to communicate. And so he said that he had to learn all of those different styles in order to properly communicate to the people of planet Earth.
Exactly. Very well said. Oh, this was so fun. Okay, so in Birmingham, there was a music store. It was called the Forbes, Piano? Forbes.
Yes.
It was called Forbes. And mostly they had pianos, but he would go there, I think it said almost every day.
Yeah, regularly.
To play the pianos. And, he would play for like hours and people would crowd around and like he would take requests of songs. And this is when he's, in this like early preteen, teenage years. But what's so cool about this place is that they also had whatever like the latest technology was at the time. And we're talking the 30s. So they had a Celeste. That was, I think, the first sort of electric piano item that they had at the store that existed, that they were able to procure as something they could sell in a retail establishment. And, he was able to get his hands on that before, anybody else. And in 1939, when the Hammond solo box came out, he bought that right away. So whatever that first, whenever something came out, he was the first. He wanted to have it. He wanted to play with it. He wanted to make it part of his rig.
He was quite the gearhead.
Yeah, I feel like he might be the first gearhead.
Yeah. And if you look at that Hammond solo Vox, they say it was like packed in kind of like, not quite like a kitchenette, but, similar idea, that it had everything, right there. It was very portable.
It was in a suitcase.
It was kind of like almost like an accordion vibe, but an electric piano version.
It was like this little mini keys.
Mm-hmm, mini keys.
And he would attach it underneath the keys of the piano and sort of extend the sound that way.
He liked to have double keyboards, it seems. He
Yes.
kind of always had a couple going on.
We were saying this when we were watching a lot of performances. He is like, and I don't know, first, second, fifth, whatever. But at least in the jazz world, he was the first to use electric pianos and synthesizers. But he is like, seems like he's the first one to build like a synth circle around himself, like a keyboard.
Yeah, the wall
world,
of synths.
like we're so used to seeing with like Tangerine Dream.
Yeah, or Ricky Wakeman.
Yes. I feel like, he's one of the earliest examples of that. I don't think too many people were traveling with multiple keyboards in the 50s and early 60s. But you see him in this, I don't know what you call it, but I need to come up with a nickname for it because I see it so often, but like the keyboard circle. Mm-hmm. And, incorporating electric pianos and synthesizers eventually once those became possible.
Well, and like you said, he was a pioneer. He would buy the thing immediately after it was released. So, he was literally, the first person you'd see with like a
whatever the thing
Wurlitzer,
was. He was always the first to have
later
it. Yeah.
a Moog, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, so the Hammond Solo Box was the first thing he had, and then when the Wurlitzer came out, he had that. So
the electric piano.
yeah.
I also have that he used a clavioline, which you may remember from our discussion about Joe Meek.
Yes.
And the Tornadoes.
He
it
did.
was
He
used on Telstar.
Mm-hmm.
And he apparently had one of those. It had vacuum tube oscillators. And it was, cited as an organ. But
it's sometimes called like the first synthesizer.
But I think that was for marketing purposes.
Yeah.
The thing about the synthesizer is, especially pre, Model D Minimoog blowing up, for live musicians, like, that people that would develop these things were like, okay, we have this thing, we think it sounds pretty cool, but how do we market it? How do we even, communicate to people what it is? And so you see that a lot in the history of electronic instruments.
The organ was something that was very common that people had and very easily marketable. So I think that was sort of the category that everything fell into.
It's an organ.
Yeah.
Yeah, It's an Organ was kind of like the tastes like chicken of electronic instruments.
Yeah, I mean, you got to get people to be open to trying these things. But Sun Ra, you did not need to open his mind. His mind was completely open, and he was just like waiting for the technology to be where his mind already was.
Give me the weird stuff.
Yeah. And, a lot of people in his early life would say like, I've never met a person like him. There's really no one that has these interests that we've met, and with the talent too. I mean, you really can't dismiss how talented he was as a pianist.
Right. Yeah. When you hear people in his band get interviewed and they say, like he was, throwing down like, some of the greats, like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, those names get thrown out, Miles Davis, like they say that he held his own, Thelonious Monk.
Yeah.
Like
those people said that about him too.
Yeah. They were like, yeah, we got a lot of crap, so to speak, when we first started as well, but his music swings.
Yeah. He didn't care about commercialization. He didn't care about being accepted by mainstream in any way. And he had a lot to say about the record industry and mainstream music and consumption of, what people were listening to and what was being force-fed to them and what he thought should be. He saw a lot of problems with that. The way that, the marketing of things and who was allowed to be popular. He could see things from a different angle that, it's probably easy for us to see now. We have the internet, we have history, but he was living in those moments and saying things that, we would say now from the future, but he was saying them in the moment. He's very future-minded. So I think a lot of that comes from the other most kind of influential element I found from his childhood was that there was a library at the Black Masonic Lodge in his area that he was allowed to go and, he could read all the books for free and have access to them. But what kind of books were there? Some pretty weird stuff. Not your typical, encyclopedias at the library. This was a curated library for the lodge. We keep talking about Lodge 49. We've been talking about that a lot. That it had, books on Freemasonry and, esoteric topics and the occult, Egyptology, which probably wasn't called that at the time.
It wasn't your mother's library.
Yeah. So to me, that when I read that, I was like, oh, if you're 11, 12, 13 years old and you're reading these books voraciously, it sounds like all he did was read books and play piano and write arrangements, then, that's pretty formative time. During that time is when, the music industry tries to capture children's ears with pop music, right? That's the stuff that you remember so nostalgically from your youth. What was so impactful for you? Well, he was reading about Freemasonry and, alternate religions and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Mm-hmm. And that's, what formed his open mind. He was obviously already very open, but then that kind of education gave him the language, I guess, to express his ideas.
And then the war came along.
Yes. I will say, before the war, though, he did go to college. He did have a teacher.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He squeezed college in there.
He did have a music teacher in high school that actually recruited him for her band because she was trying to, make it as a singer, as a jazz singer. And I feel like that's really important because that's when, she actually ditched the band to go to New York, but she had formed it. And so Sun Ra actually became the leader of that band and kept it going. And I think that was his first experience being a band leader.
He gravitated toward the leadership aspect, yeah. Yeah,
so that was a very formative time for him, and he continued to play in clubs and play professionally from being a teenager, and he never stopped, really. But he did, have a teacher get him a scholarship to college to study music. But he was only there for a year. And while he was there...
It was like kind of technical vocational school kind of thing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He claimed, maybe a decade after this, he started telling this story. Before we jump into the war, can we go to the story?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah. I wasn't trying to jump the gun.
I know, it's hard. I want to talk about the timeline, but also the ideas. It's not my favorite part of the
story anyway, to be honest. It's probably the worst part of the story.
It's very sad.
Yeah.
But I think this is, kind of tells you why all of that happened. He started telling this story, from what we can tell, in the early 50s. 1952 is when people said they first heard him telling this story. But he claims that in this first year of college that he was in, about 1936, that he was abducted by aliens. And I actually have the actual text of what his story was, because they say that his story never changed. That would have been, 40 some years that he was telling the story and it never changed. So that's pretty rare. So to him, it was real. We will perpetuate the myth that it was real. He was in what we would consider, he was meditating. He didn't call it that, but deep concentration. He claimed that a bright light appeared around him and that his whole body was changed. I think he called it transmolecularization. He could see through himself. So his molecular makeup changed, and he was taken up out of his human form, and he was landed on a planet that he identified as Saturn. So he claims he was teleported, and these aliens wanted to talk with him. Oh, he says they had an antenna on each ear and an antenna over each eye. And they told him to stop attending college. He said there was going to be great trouble in the schools and the world's going into complete chaos, and that he was to speak through his music and the world would listen. And then they dropped him back on Earth. So his myth is, you know, this is the origins of it, if you've ever been curious. We did a lot of research to find out, you know, when did he start telling this story? Did it ever change? Did the timeline change of when it happened? There have been reports that he said it happened when he was in Chicago, which would have been in the 40s, but other reports that it happened, and this is why he dropped out of college. So it's hard to reconcile that a little bit, but from what we can tell from our research, from our X-Files research on UFO stories and alien abduction stories, even if he started telling this story in 1952, it is one of the very first tellings of an alien abduction story. There were UFO sightings that happened as early as 1897. And there was one sci-fi book that I found from the 20s that described, hey, you know what? Since we're exploring these sci-fi ideas, there's probably a chance that alien abduction could be a thing. I didn't quite say it that way. Mm-hmm. But, you know, the chances of him having read that book, maybe it was in the Masonic Lodge library. Maybe. That's the only thing I can point to. But outside of that, alien abduction stories didn't start until 1957. So I think it's fair to say that, you know, he was abducted by aliens before anyone else.
Right.
And was able to have a way of seeing the world and speaking to the world through music and also his poetry to give us a sense that, you know, we are self-destructing. You know, the story that he was telling, the myth that he was propagating is really not any different than what we need to hear today, which is, right, like, you know, nuclear war, the way we're treating the planet, you know, we're destroying everything and our priorities in the wrong place.
Right. Yeah. The misplaced priorities. You know, he definitely felt like the human race was on a downturn.
Mm-hmm. And that he was here. He said his mission was mission impossible. He was here to save the planet, save humanity, by telling, you know, through the music, through the cosmic vibrations of the music, he was tuning into the universe and trying to share that message because it's the universal language, right? He could go, and they did travel the world with their music. He could go anywhere in the world, and music was the universal language that could reach people.
Yeah, exactly.
So when the war came around, just a few years after this alien abduction happened, they also, it wasn't in this passage, but he was told to promote peace. That was the key element, that, you know, no more war, we need peace. So when the war came around and he was drafted for World War II, he became a conscientious objector, saying that, you know, he cannot be part of this war because he's here to promote peace. He went before a judge with this conscientious objection and they rejected it. And then he tried to use, you know, his health. He had a health issue. They rejected that. And then they assigned him to, I guess, manual labor, forestry. And he didn't show up. So that's why he was arrested, actually. So anyone who was a conscientious objector in World War II was assigned manual labor. And he rejected that, so he was sent to jail. He was in jail for a year, and he appealed again he was like, okay, I'll go do that manual labor now.
Yeah, he did. He did eventually do it.
Yeah, so he did that. But eventually, I think they also released him for his health issues. So this is probably the span of like 2 or 3 years that he's fighting against this. Although one interesting detail I read was that when he went before the judge, when they were like, you have to be drafted, like all of these reasons aren't, you know, worthwhile, we're rejecting all of this. He said that if he went to war, he was going to use his training and the weapons to kill the highest military officer he could find. And
that's how he ended up getting thrown in jail.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were like, okay, buddy.
What? They said they had never met anyone like him before. Again, another person who says this about him.
In a very harsh manner, from what I remember.
He was very bold, and he felt, I think, emboldened by this mission that he is not human. He is here to promote peace, and he is here to share a message that, you know, we need to embrace the unknown, and we need to, you know, raise our consciousness. So these are words I'm using. I don't know if he would use them. It's hard to find the right language for how he talked about things. He's very poetic.
I loved it, yeah.
Yes, here, I did write this down. If he was inducted, he would use the weapons and training to kill the first high-ranking military officer.
It's like, okay, pal.
Yeah, go clean up the forest for a while. We're going to keep an eye on you.
So
but after he was released, he went back to Birmingham, and from there, he decided to move to Chicago, which, was part of a migration.
That was happening at the time,
from people from the South going to Chicago, and it became sort of the center of culture.
It was a happening place.
Very happening. This is in the 40s.
He always goes to
1946.
the places that are the most happening. So we'll continue to see that throughout his life.
He seems to have like this beacon that puts him right where like the most pivotal cultural movements are happening, right in those moments.
Yep.
It's kind of hard to dismiss this idea that he's like a future being, because he seemed to always know. So he went to Chicago in 1946, and this is really where he finds his community, and he finds support and other people who are interested in these ideas that he's been so interested in. There's political activism and, other people who were reading these same interesting books that he had been reading. So he found other people he actually started a book club to talk about these ideas.
He got in one of his more successful trios.
Yeah, he was also playing music this whole time, right? Even, when he was doing the manual labor, they let him play piano at night.
Right. Yeah.
So there was never a time when he wasn't playing music. He also didn't believe in sleep.
He was a catnapper.
Yeah. Apparently, during rehearsals, because if they weren't rehearsing, they were performing. There was really no end to the music. He would be playing, and then he would just take a cat nap. But there was no discussion of it, and you didn't know when he was going to wake up again. So if you were in the orchestra, you had to always be ready to be rehearsing again.
Mm-hmm. When he would
apparently,
wake up.
Thomas Edison and Da Vinci and Napoleon also catnapped.
Oh, and many more, yeah.
I'm sure many more. It was like this idea that geniuses don't sleep, which I don't want to perpetuate because I think sleep is very important for our health. But some people do sleep in these catnap cycles, which
I'm starting to get to the stage in my life where I might start taking on the catnap philosophy because I don't sleep through the night anyway at this point.
That's a good point.
And so it's like, well, what if I woke up right now, got out of bed? I'm already awake.
Yeah.
What if I just get out of bed and
don't fight it
and start playing guitar?
Yeah. And then in the afternoon, I get tired. So want to sleep, but I fight it because I'm like, no, I won't sleep tonight. And then I don't sleep anyway. There's something to this.
I feel like I would write,
but it's also really bad for your heart.
Ideas, in that state.
That's true.
Because my thoughts are in a place where I'm thinking very clearly. I have a very clear account of the past.
You're connected to a different part of your brain. Your different brain waves are firing.
And it's ooh, I want that part of me to write some music.
Yeah. So if things start getting weird in our world, and you start noticing that we're doing things at different times of day, we've decided to start catnapping. Might as well. If it worked for Sun Ra, then, it doesn't get much better than that.
Yeah, I'll take a minute to say that Sun Ra, after doing all this research, has become one of my absolute personal heroes.
Yeah.
And I am very much obsessed with his way of living and being, and I'm really on board with it and have enjoyed learning about it.
Yeah, it's been really inspiring, just because it takes you down sort of alternative pathways and ideas to explore. Not so much
commitment level. It's the commitment level that's so inspiring. I'm just so impressed with his degree of commitment to the things that he was passionate about.
Yeah, when he was in Chicago, like I was saying, he met sort of like-minded people. He also met this teenager who became his business manager. They started a book club, and they started, gathering more people to be part of the Arkestra. So it started with just a trio, and then eventually they started adding more and more people. But the whole concept was this sort of monk-like devotion to the music and to the group. So, if you were in the orchestra, you had to expect, rehearsals were every day. They could be in the middle of the night. They could be early in the morning. You had to always be ready. And he expected discipline and precision. Those are two things he says throughout his life. Discipline and precision. That you can't be free. You can't play free jazz. You can't improvise without discipline and precision. Right. So he expected a lot from the people that he played with, and that he was, he mostly, I would say, arranged and wrote most of the parts. I mean, they were reading music, even though it seemed very free and there were moments of improvisation. It was composed. It was arranged. It was pre-planned. It was rehearsed.
The melodic themes were definitely, something that was written on sheet music or on paper, and
even solos. He would write their solos.
Yeah, the solos, you'd think that they were just completely going off, and they were actually, something they had rehearsed. And I think that was part of the magic for him, is he liked making or composing music that seemed a lot more free than it actually was. Like, you can tell that he enjoyed being sort of a marionette of sorts.
He
with his
really,
band.
like you were saying, he really embraced this idea of being a leader. He thought that we didn't have enough of that in our society, right? Like, why did we reject this idea of having leaders? And I'm curious to look into that a little bit more, but you can see that he was a leader, but he wasn't, even though he was like, this is how it's going to be if you're part of my crew, he wasn't confrontational. He wasn't dictatorial, like authoritative, His presence was very calm. He was just doing it. And if you were doing it, you were there and you were doing it together.
For example, if he wasn't into the way that you were playing, if you were part of the orchestra, he wouldn't just scream at you in the middle of a rehearsal. He would tell everyone else except for you to come to a meeting place, probably packed and ready to go, and he would skip town. This was literally in an excerpt that I read from his Wikipedia.
Wow, I didn't catch that one.
Yeah, they would just skip town. I guess the bass player was telling this story.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so you would just find yourself stranded. I guess this would happen. This was sort of, it makes sense that it would happen on the road. Like if they were playing shows, this would be, if somebody, played a few wrong notes at a gig or something, I get the impression that he was strict. He just wasn't confrontational.
Yeah. You weren't going to get yelled at. You were just going to get ghosted.
He didn't yell.
He invented ghosting.
He invented ghosting.
That's the most extreme form of ghosting I've heard in a while.
Yeah, it is.
He talks about how and it was less about playing a wrong note and more just being on the wrong vibe, being in the wrong frequency, you just didn't fit. He said it would just be so obvious
that you didn't fit,
even to the audience, that you just didn't belong in
Always
the group.
The idea that you were part of a bigger picture that he had very, specifically in his mind.
That he was on that wavelength. He was riding that frequency, and if you were riding it, it was obvious to him. And if you weren't, that was also obvious. But he would pick people up, along the way that were sort of like a diamond in the rough situation, that he saw potential, that maybe people had forgotten about these. They were sort of like forgotten people. And he would bring them into the fold and, try to get them on the wavelength. And a lot of people did, and a lot of people didn't. There was a lot of passing through. It sounded to me like he would prefer if people had stayed forever, like the right people. That he was like, you're on the frequency. Let's do this forever, for infinity. But a lot of people wanted to have families. So this sort of monk lifestyle, it wasn't just like, okay, you have to be on the wavelength with me. You also have to give up any desire to have your own home, your own life, go out after the shows, have a family.
I mean, they were essentially on call.
Yeah. They all lived together at one point.
The entire band was on call. Like if you were anywhere and there was a rehearsal to be had, there was probably a messenger sent to you. And if you didn't come, you were out.
You were ghosted.
Yeah, you were ghosted on. You just, had to show up whenever they said there was rehearsals at all hours of the
All
night
hours.
because he didn't sleep. And, so basically if that was going to be a problem in any way.
Yeah, it was very obvious if he didn't fit the culture. Just to jump back into the timeline a little bit, to live inside of time, which he did not, but we do. Maybe we don't. I don't know. What is time? They did form a record label, so he's like one of the first people to, in this genre, have his own independent label and maintain that through their entire legacy. It's called Saturn Records, and they pressed and released all their albums. So that's why I think it was 100 full-length albums.
Yeah.
100 full length and over 1,000 singles.
And a lot of times different versions of songs would get substituted on, like say the West Coast pressing of this certain record collection that they put together, like there'd just be songs would be swapped out.
It's very hard to track the actual albums, the actual releases, because they would press stuff for their live shows. And then everyone in the band would be given a stack to hand out, and they would all do their own artwork.
It was the absolute opposite of the pop model.
There's millions of cover art versions of each release. There's millions of versions of each song. So anything that you're finding album-wise, physical or digital copies, like these are sort of like curated compilations that have been pieced together. And kind of after the fact.
If you find a non-reissue album of Sun Ra, buy it.
Yeah.
And ship it to me. No,
it's priceless.
Just buy the thing. Like if you see it, you got to get it. It's mandatory.
I think there's actually a lot on CD because.
Well, a lot of stuff was reissued.
That was like the time, he passed in the 90s, and that's when CDs were booming. So I think there's probably a lot of CDs floating around more than vinyl. That were maintained. But, just to talk about the group and when it formed. So in the 50s in Chicago, they started forming the Arkestra. And I think it was in the late 50s is when it sort of like officially became the Arkestra. And when they started dressing in the space age, sort of Egyptian science fiction themed costumes. And because Sun Ra had been... he'd been a band leader, he'd been, a pianist in other bands in Chicago for so long. And they always had to wear a uniform, right? They always had to wear a suit. And he really liked the idea of the uniform, but he took it, to outer space. So it wasn't just, let's look as weird as possible. It was a way for everyone to have a uniform. But it's like immediately, this isn't going to be a traditional jazz show.
Yeah, and to think about it, like he, his formative years in music were spent during the big band era. Yeah. So this was sort of his take on the big band.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
He's like, this is
seemed
my
to really,
version.
Like align with the idea of, being a band leader and having a band. But
right, and you see the Benny Goodman footage and everything, and there's, there's like everybody's got like a little podium.
Yeah, you got to wear your tails, your full tails. Like it's matching, a very, very put together.
Matching suits.
But he really didn't want to be taken seriously, right? Like he wanted you to immediately, if you're in this space and you see what's going on, already your constructs are broken, right? You're already thinking outside the box, right? He needed to get you there as fast as possible so he could get you as deep into this idea as possible. He felt very called to this mission. In 1961, the orchestra moved to New York City, to the Village. So they all lived together because they couldn't afford to otherwise. We were joking about how we're like, wow, even in the 60s in the Village, it wasn't affordable. Like,
oh, yeah.
Was there ever a time anything was affordable, ever?
Well, yeah, in terms of whatever their standards were for rent.
But it makes sense. Like, live together, it's more affordable. You can rehearse, be on call all the time. But they got it took 5 years. So they moved to New York City in 1961. And by 1966, they had gotten a residency at Slug's Saloon. So this was their regular Monday night gig. If you were around during that time, you may have seen them. They performed every Monday night, and they attracted the, the avant-garde crowd of the time, and the other artists of the time that were in the village. So they were in this like space where, yes, there was avant-garde jazz happening, but it was much more of the like Greenwich Village folk explosion.
But also members of the Velvet Underground.
Yeah. That whole convergence, like, that's not the place you would think, oh, we're a big band. Like, we're a weird big band. Let's go to this place. Like, that wouldn't be where you would expect to go, but it was exactly the right place for them to be accepted by a new audience and to be encouraged to be even weirder. Right? During this time, they were able to be even freer and explore more avant-garde ideas because it was in the air. It was accepted. It was expected. It was desired by the audiences. Right? So a lot of like what can happen with a band is like, is the audience handling it? Are they receiving it? Are they supporting it?
Right. And obviously he leaned into this, sort of the way people were, continuing to be more open, to receive this sort of entertainment, like he's like, oh, great, this is finally starting to align.
I'm thinking too, like BB and Louis Barron were there during this time.
Yeah.
So this convergence of like, we always like to look at the other people we've studied, the tape musicians of, the early electronic pioneers from the 50s and 60s, like who were they rubbing elbows with and bumping into? And I feel like they were probably around during this time. So I need to look into that a little bit more and see if there's any references to those people encountering Sun Ra, because I think they would have really liked it and engaged in the sort of like the gearness together as well. Right.
Yeah. And, like you said, though, it was 5 years, but that's a pretty short time in the timeline of Sun Ra.
That's true. I just didn't realize how long it had been. It was during this time that he started using tape delay to assemble spatial sound pieces. So the first recording, if you've heard Saturn, that incorporates tape delay. I haven't found any evidence of like the specific gear he was using. I haven't seen any, articles on that, but I pulled that out of something specifically.
Maybe he was using... I was like,
ding, ding, ding.
I mean, a lot of times when people experimented with tape delay in the world of early electronic music, it was simply just an extra tape recorder they had, like it wasn't a commercial unit.
Yeah, I would expect that. A lot of the other band members, when they were interviewed, talked about how, they rehearsed so much, and whatever gear was around, he was always doing something that wasn't supposed to be done with it. He was creating reverbs and delays and, overdrive and, he was trying to create some new sound. He was trying to get something out of these machines that they weren't supposed to do, right? So he was always experimenting. And so I imagine if they had, the tape recorders around in the space with them while they're practicing, recording, that he was messing around with all that. Right. To see what would happen.
I mean, that's the beauty of tape, is that it lends itself to messing around with it. You have this device that, is meant to record, but there's other controls on it.
Yeah.
And so they sort of beg you to play.
Yeah, I've heard, like Pauline Oliveros talk about that. Tape machines were what were around, so they just started doing other stuff with it.
What else can we do with this thing?
This is what we have.
Right.
So little did they know that would spawn all the most important ideas.
Well, the crazy thing is that, all of these years later, it's still extremely hip and fun and the thing that everybody wants to do. Like Tascam, release a tape, a 4-track. Like everybody will be excited, and, we won't buy one because we already have it. And we're broke, but...
Yeah. You can only buy so much gear at once. But if they did that, I'm sure we would eventually want to have that. It would be very popular. I'm sure they get messages every day.
Well, they're teasing it a lot right now. I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but, it's the 50th anniversary of Tascam. And so they're, showing all these... like 80s ads for 4-tracks and their reel-to-reels and their mixers and everything. And so it seems a little fishy to me.
Yeah, why are you teasing us like this, Tascam?
All the vintage stuff.
Give us the goods.
All the tapes. His tape.
They have their
Here.
reasons. They're legitimate reasons, but
Sponsor the podcast.
we can figure it out. If we put our heads together, we can figure this out, Tascam. Shortly after they got that residency in the village, they moved to Philadelphia because the building they were living in was sold and became too expensive to live there. Not a familiar story at all. So they moved to Philly and they bought a house. And again, they all lived together, but they still traveled to New York every week for their residency. So it was
once
just,
you get in New York, you're gonna hold on to that.
That's still, I mean, obviously not today, and nobody's doing anything right now. But that's still a very common thing. When we lived in New York, there was always talk of like, what if we all moved to Philly?
Right.
Because the train is so easy to go back and forth, and there were people we knew who were doing that.
Or Jersey.
It was Philly because it's cheaper.
Right.
Cheaper to travel as well.
Gotcha.
It's very expensive to travel from Jersey into the city.
I did not know
tolls.
that, and I did not live there for very long, so that explains that.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite stories. And if you've seen the documentary A Joyful Noise, then you already know this story, but I love this story, so I'm going to tell it. So when they moved to Philadelphia, they obviously set up a rehearsal space in the basement of this house, and they were playing every day, all manner of hours of the night and day. And at one point, the cops came, and they said, we've had a request for you guys to turn it down, right? A noise complaint, if you will. And what are you all doing in here? We heard you're playing loud music. And apparently Sun Ra came to the door with a Bible, and he said, we're making a joyful noise. We're not making music. We're making a joyful noise. And he pointed to the scripture that said, about making a joyful noise. And so apparently they never bothered him again. And the community actually really felt like they were a positive influence, on the neighborhood. So they were welcomed and supported, even though they were making a joyful noise at all hours of the night.
They had a drug-free
That's true. He was very
reputation.
He was very adamant that, he didn't do drugs or drink, and he wanted that, he didn't want anyone using drugs to get to the higher consciousness. The music was the conduit for that.
But also it makes sense when you're, corralling a large group of people
in the 60s and 70s.
if that was not necessarily your reputation, at least, not to say that it never happened.
It's a good PR spin for sure.
It's a way to keep having your rehearsals and not getting complained on. And even if they were complained on, they weren't going to find anything. So, it definitely, I would say, helped the cause.
But I think too, because he was all about discipline. And so for me, it sounds like, if you're going to have discipline and precision, you can't really be spacing out on drugs.
Right. And think about touring, one of the stories that I hear constantly in the music industry is how people get busted when they're on tour.
Oh my gosh.
And
most common thing.
Obviously that was, something that an experience he did not want to have.
Yeah.
Having
very wise.
Spent some time in jail.
He just didn't want to mess around with any of that.
Yeah. So, that was a really smart move.
But I think it's also of the time, the people who were talking about these cosmic ideas were mostly people who were engaging with drugs. And for him to, again, be in the center of these cultural hotbeds and not be doing that just proves again how outside of time,
it was more countercultural,
how future thinking he was,
to not
He's like,
be on
no,
drugs.
that's not it. This is the real message.
Or I'm already there.
Yeah.
It sort of validated his status as a non-human by not participating in drugs.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe they just didn't work for him because they're
didn't work
of
with
the
his
earth.
chemistry.
Yeah. Interesting. Oh, when they were living in this Philadelphia
Would
house...
LSD get an alien high?
I've literally never thought about that before.
Not to call
You've left
Sun
me
Ra
speechless.
an alien, but...
He didn't... Yeah, he said he was of the angel race.
A non-human. He said he was not human.
Yeah. Does
Anything
LSD
but
only
human.
work for humans? I don't know. That's fascinating. There was a tree across the street from their house in Philadelphia that was struck by lightning, and they turned it into a drum. I thought that was awesome.
Yes, that was a super cool
They called
story.
it the Cosmic Infinity Drum. So if you ever see them playing live and there's this big, wooden drum and he's playing it with these curved staves,
Yeah.
that's the Cosmic Infinity Drum. So I feel like that was like a lot, like whenever the shows started, like that's how they opened, setting the tone with the Cosmic Infinity Drum.
Yeah,
and
that
kinda
drum became sort of the star of the show.
Keeps the glue, I guess.
Listening to the gentleman that made it tell that story.
Yeah,
was
James
just
Jackson.
So cool.
Yeah. He said something about how like
It took him
Sun
like
Ra,
a year to figure out how to do it.
Yes.
Like I
Talk
just
about
love
discipline.
Yeah, I love that, he just worked on this thing for a year, and learned everything about how to do it. And then if you look at it, the artwork is like a nod
He did
to
a carving.
the Egyptian carvings, and it was just super elaborate, super awesome. It looked like it was something that came out of King Tut's cat.
Yeah, it did. It looked like an artifact.
Yeah. Tomb or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a central instrument. He did require that, all the horn players also played reed instruments and flutes. So everyone had, when you watch the live performances, you'll see all these really interesting instruments along with traditional ones, and everyone's swapping things out all the time. And that was Sun Ra specifically requesting. Because I think people got hired, for a specific instrument that they played, but then he was like, nah, I need all these other things. So everyone had to be a multi-instrumentalist, which, sounds fun to me.
For sure.
I didn't know this. He was on Rolling Stone in 1969. He was on the cover. I want to find that. I'm going to look that up and put it in our group. So if you're in the Cosmic Tape Music Club Facebook group, we'll be throwing some cool stuff that we find that we've been talking about in this podcast in the group. So you can watch the videos we're talking about, the documentaries. You can see these photos, magazine covers.
Back when Rolling Stone was cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the height of Rolling Stone being cool is 1969. And he was on the cover. So the hip, cool people understood that he was, an icon of the time. Even if he wasn't as well known. He wasn't on the radio. He was on like college radio or local radio stuff.
And we haven't even gotten to the California era yet.
Yeah. So he started, I want to say around 1969, they started traveling to the West Coast. And playing shows out there. And they were very, I'd say, well received, but not by who they expected to be received by. I think there was an anecdote about how the Deadheads did not get it. It was like too far out for them.
Yeah, and you'd think that, like a jam band like the Grateful Dead, with the acid tests and everything, all these, they were very...
Well, again, that's a very...
with the strange and the eclectic.
But from the drug angle.
From the drug angle. Maybe it was the fact
Whereas
that...
they, I think actually there was somebody who said that they would drop acid right at the beginning of Sun Ra shows.
Yeah, people were definitely
And
on
then,
drugs
like,
watching Sun Ra.
Halfway through, you were like, oh, I get it now.
Right, it would make sense.
But I also wonder
You'd
if
get on the level.
the drug culture made it to didn't jive. It wasn't the right frequency for the experience. I
Which
often
is
wonder.
very interesting.
I'll never know. I'll never get to do that experiment. But maybe some of you have, and you can share your stories with us. He actually became an artist in residence at UC Berkeley in 1971. He taught a course called The Black Man in the Cosmos. Apparently, it was like half the class he was talking about, his philosophies, and then certain books he assigned, and then the other half was the orchestra playing.
I'd love to see a lecture.
It wasn't a well-attended course, apparently.
Love to be a fly on the wall
And
during
didn't
that lecture.
last for very long, but yeah. I don't know if there's any footage of that. I haven't found any yet. But if you attended his course,
and it's
we'd
such a
love to hear from you.
prestigious institution, it's no slouch of an
Yeah, it's really
institution.
interesting that, they did their first tour out there and then stayed for a while.
As many did.
Yeah. They got sucked into the the strange trip. I do. It's funny because I was thinking about, whenever I watch the group, the Arkestra in, there's a video of them in Egypt. They're performing, but it's also a theatrical performance because there's not actual audio. Mm-hmm. There's audio that was added later. It reminds me of the Merry Pranksters.
It totally does. Yeah, I get that.
But they had a different mission. They were more disciplined. Obviously, they're a band. But there's this element of like dressing in ways that kind of break the norms, right? Like trying to throw you off and put you in a different element, bring you into this world that they've created. And the style of dance and theatricality, it's mixing so many elements and styles. Okay, so this leads into, probably the most famous thing about Sun Ra is the movie Space is the Place. Space is the Place is probably something you think of when you hear Sun Ra, like the most common phrase. Album, it was a movie. It was something they said for a long time before it became, the tagline. As with most of their songs or albums, like they evolved over time. They played them a lot and there were lots of different versions, but it gets like cemented by this movie from 1974. And apparently I wondered how it was funded. So I looked into it and it was apparently a San Francisco public TV station producer.
How did this get made?
Yeah, that was the first thought I had. There's a podcast called How Did This Get Made about weird like B movies, and I feel like they should do Space is the Place if they haven't already. Mm-hmm. But it was actually, a TV station producer, or a couple of them. They worked with a screenwriter, and, the credits actually say that Sun Ra wrote it, I thought. Wrote it and produced it and directed it.
Sounds right.
But it sounds like there's a lot more behind it, because it is, it's a, an indie production, but it's definitely got a story and multiple cameras, and it's not just like some DIY thing. Yeah,
for a Sun Ra experience, it was high budge, I would say.
Yeah. It's a really out there of its time film.
Like absolutely watch it.
Definitely watch it, and it will give you a lot of insight into all these things we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people stop there, and there's so much more to explore. So don't stop at Space is the Place, but it's a good entry point. There's some really cool footage in there of, his character is in a spaceship, and it has synthesizers in it, obviously. So I don't know when he
arrives on a spaceship.
Yeah. Oh, the spaceship itself is amazing. I don't know who built this thing, but they had amazing production design. The spaceship is so awesome, but when you go inside of it, it's like a hall of mirrors kind of vibe, and his Minimoog is in there, and it's just like a set that I'd want to live in. Like, I wouldn't be upset if my house that I lived in was that spaceship.
Yeah, for sure.
It's very cool. There was, so this was done they actually filmed it in Oakland, and simultaneously while they were filming the movie, they also recorded the album Space is the Place, which is considered like the soundtrack because some of the songs are the same, but there's a lot of songs that aren't in the movie that are on the album. It was just kind of like a simultaneous recording that they were doing. Mm-hmm. And something I heard Sun Ra say about the recording process, if you're curious, is that he was a one-take kind of guy, kind of non-human.
Hey, that sounds familiar.
He wanted it precise, he wanted it accurate, but it had to be one take. That is how I like to do things as well. Because, you want that live feeling, and he didn't want to do any overdubs or any editing. And I think that, speaks to the fact that the way that they performed, when you're live, you only get one shot. And the energy from that is different than if you're trying to cut and paste it together.
Yeah, I've seen, talking about you for a sec, I've seen this, like, you have this ability to, I don't know if there's like a chemical reaction that happens for you or something, but like once, like we're in a one take scenario and you really shine. Oh, and I think that nice you have helped me get better in that regard.
Interesting.
Because
we definitely come at the recording process from a different background.
like I'm embracing that more now and feel like I've gotten better at it because of you.
And I've had to learn more of the, layering, overdubbing, doing multiple takes, splicing things together approach. And it's a different part of my brain, And
I think that maybe people that were involved with Sun Ra maybe were enlightened in the same respect. Like he probably, obviously, they're engaged in these, rigorous performances or rehearsals, and, like you had to be there, and it was, very much something that, you'd have to be really committed to the lifestyle, to stay part of. And I feel like that was part of the attraction, was that like, he made you a better performer. He made you a better recording artist because he was, he stuck to his guns, when it came to, his philosophies about it. And I respect that. Yeah,
you were on the Sun Ra spaceship or you were off. There was no convincing him otherwise. So definitely watch Space is the Place. Oh, this is another thing I want to drop in the group when I find it, but apparently they performed on Saturday Night Live in 1978. So you may find it before we do. Drop it in the group. I really got to see this.
And that was an amazing era for Saturday Night Live.
That's true.
As a cast.
I would be curious what the episode was, like who was in the cast at the time. So during the same time, 78 to 80, they introduced the Outer Space Visual Communicator. This was it's called a large electronic creation. So Bill Sebastian actually invented this, and it produced images while they were playing live. It was performed at a keyboard, and they would position it center stage behind the Arkestra, and Bill would sit on stage with them. And I read that it actually was like, you would like finger paint with light to create the images. So there are some examples, some video examples, so I'm going to put that in the group as well. But if you have been to one of these experiences with the Outer Space Visual Communicator, would love to hear about what that was like.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it's a brief time. They kept using it, on and off later, but it says just 78 to 80 is really when they were using it at every performance. Yeah,
post in the comments your Sun Ra stories, like if you've had any personal Sun Ra stories, it would be awesome to...
because everyone's experience is so unique, right? Just like there are thousands of recordings of all these songs, everyone's experiences of seeing them live, every live show was different, right? And your perception of what was going on is different than someone else's. So I feel like we could put together like a mosaic of millions of stories and, experiences of being around him or seeing them perform. From 80 to 90, they just kept performing and recording. The Joyful Noise, that was 1980, that documentary. And then in 1990, he had his first stroke. So that's sort of the arc of the life and story of the Sun Ra Orchestra. But I'd really like to get into the cosmic keys of Sun Ra. We'd love to just take a moment to dive into the instruments he was using.
But before that, I just wanted to note that there is an amazing archive that already exists. Like if you're interested in all things Sun Ra, the website is sunraarchive.webstarts.com.
We'll throw that in our private group as well.
Yeah.
Maybe in the show notes too. We'll throw, the references that we're talking about into the show notes.
But there's, just an encyclopedic account.
A lot of people have been keeping archives for a long time and just keeping all the artifacts and the documents to keep this all alive.
But that's the one.
But that's where it is all now on the interweb. That's where it lives.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, keyboard wise, I want to tell the story of the Moog factory.
Yeah, go for it.
So picture it, 1969.
He's just been on the cover of Rolling Stone.
We don't know.
It was around, it's like a month apart.
it's said
from when it
that,
came out. He might have done the shoot earlier.
you know, he gets an opportunity in October from a associate of his that was a journalist for Downbeat magazine.
Yes, so he was the Rolling Stone came out in May. So
Right, and that guy's name was Tam Fiofori. And he set up a meeting set up an experience, I guess, to visit the Moog factory.
but before that, Gershon Kingsley actually did a demonstration
I thought
for
that
him.
was at the factory.
No, it was
okay.
in New York City. Gershon Kingsley did a demonstration for Sun Ra of the modular.
Of the modular, which led to
Which is why he was like, I gotta know more about this.
right, and so
This all happened like in within a few months of each other.
he visited the factory, which at the time was in Trumansburg, New York, and they were testing the prototype of the Minimoog, and this was the Model B, which is very rare, but it was actually given to Sun Ra after this experience so that he could try it out on the road. They were curious about the roadworthiness of the synth. But while he was at the factory I think Gershon Kingsley was also there sort of guiding him. You know, he did a demonstration and a rather long performance that was never intended for commercial release, but he did it at the factory, and it eventually was released, of course.
Yeah, in the 90s.
And this led to, you know, his experiments like Space Probe.
Yes. If you have not heard, I think it's about a 17-minute long piece called Space Probe. It's on one of the collections.
Yes.
It is just such an amazing example of how he could take something that already was an instrument that nobody had played with and make it sound like nothing you've ever heard and like nobody else was doing.
They say that, you know, and I've listened to this and agree that, you know, he basically did just about anything you can imagine to do in this one performance. You know, he like demonstrated almost all of the types of sounds, you know, one might make in a single performance, you know, and I've listened to it and I agree. I mean, you're like, oh yeah, there's the LFO modulating the pitch, and there it is modulating the filter, and oop, there's some pink noise and some white noise, and it's being filtered, and, you know, it sounds like, you know, there's just these crazy chirping sounds and very out of this world, very spacey, you know, sounds that were being made. And, you know, it was literally his first experiment with it, you know. So that just, you know, to me exemplifies how, you know, how he addressed an instrument, you know, as a musician. And I've been extremely impressed by that. You know, you see the footage of him like basically like laying both arms down and doing like spins and stuff with his combo organ, and, you know,
And making it sound like outer space music.
Yeah, and it's just so inventive, you know, like it reminds me, you know, of other musicians that have this ability, you know, like Jimi Hendrix, you know, and how he addressed the guitar. Like, you know, Sun Ra definitely had a similar, you know, just intimacy, you know.
Yeah, I think it just plays into that philosophy they had of discipline and precision allows you to be free and to experiment.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that philosophy. Like,
yeah, it's hard to deny when you see it in action like that.
You have to rehearse so much to feel and look and present as if, you know, you are very comfortable, you know, like for it to seem natural to a group of people. The degree of planning and rehearsal that goes into that perception,
yes,
is usually
that's why I love watching
amount.
Any footage of them rehearsing. You can't really tell, like, where is he conducting? Where are they playing free? You know, it's very hard to tell.
The lines are blurred.
Very interested to just kind of burrow myself into that.
But when you
like
see
a fly on the wall.
When you see footage of his rehearsals, you can tell that every moment was kind of planned out. Like,
yeah.
You know, it was very intentional. And so I just love the, you know, how he was able to do that.
Yeah, so he was gifted that Minimoog Model B.
He wasn't gifted it. He was lent it.
They lent it to him, but they said they never got it back, but that it was, they were fine with
because,
it.
you know, like they learned so much about his, you know, the roadworthiness, you know, that there wasn't any hard feelings about it.
But he bought a Model D as soon as it came out.
So that he could have both at once.
Yeah,
you know, he wanted the polyphony basically, and wanted the ability to play maybe some like 2-note chords and stuff. Actually, you get into a bit more with the multiple oscillators.
So somehow he understood, like, I have to play both of these at the same time to create the sound that I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So there we are back with the, you know, now he's building out his synthesizer circle around himself.
Later on, it said that he got into Yamaha digital stuff, like the DX7.
Yeah, he adopted whatever was going on, right? He didn't have
SY77.
He wasn't like, ooh, it's digital.
Right.
He embraced whatever, you know, was going to allow him to achieve the results he was going for.
Yeah, and I think that was actually very, you know, it was a common move for people at the time to go from a Minimoog to a Yamaha DX7. I mean, that's why you hear the stories about Minimoogs being picked up for, you know, single digits in the 80s.
Yeah.
And
the
even
DX7
early 90s maybe.
made all of our favorite companies go under, but it also made all of those pieces of equipment very cheap at the time.
But it was also a darn fine synthesizer.
Sure.
And deserved, you know, to be as popular as it was.
It's actually the concert. He did a concert with John Cage, very controversial, which I think only just came out a few years ago, the recording. And he played the Yamaha DX7, just the DX7 at that concert, which I thought was really interesting because he's so known for, you know, playing multiple keyboards and stacking the sounds.
And tweaking, which if you've ever used a DX7, it is not a tweaker's synth. You cannot really edit a patch in real time. It doesn't have any of those types of knobs. Like everything has to be programmed ahead of time. But I guess you could set up a nice string of presets and go through those.
But yeah, that is interesting. I haven't, you know, dove into that history as much, but I do know that that's the case. That's what he played. I do want to say that he is credited as being the first jazz musician to play an electric piano. This was in 1956. It's a composition called India. So he does, I want to give him credit where credit is due. I think he cares about that. I'm not sure. I think he cares more about saving the planet. But I find it interesting. I want to give him credit for that because he's a trailblazer. Then he added the clavinet.
Which I've never really
and a combo
heard.
Organ.
Like, I haven't, like, when I saw that he used a clavinet, I was, like, kind of surprised because that's not the sound that I think of when I think of Sun Ra. But
I think he would, you know, adopt these keyboards as soon as they came out, and then, you know, another one would come.
He was on to something else.
Because a lot of, you know, if you watch the footage, he always has a different rig.
Right.
It's almost always, he had some ARP stuff at one point.
Yep. Yeah, which I could not find any
really
reference of that.
Got into Krumar.
Yeah, he had.
I saw Krumar in a lot of footage.
Which, you know, for our audience, that's an Italian company that made.
They actually recently are having a comeback, but they did go under during the dark ages of the DX7.
Yeah, they were one of the ones.
He played a DS2. He played another one as well, but that's
DS2 is really cool.
The most common one that you'll see. And again, there's so many people, like when you look up like the synths of Sun Ra, everyone's like, what did he play? Can you identify this one? Can you identify that one? Because he was always playing different things. Again, being elusive, you know, it's not about the facts, it's about the myth, right?
Yeah, is it a Gibson electric organ? Is it a Farfisa? You know, yeah, he definitely played.
He played a Farfisa.
A ton of gear.
But again, yeah, he was always swapping things out. Makes me wonder
I think he played a Gibson
if he was being like given these things. Oh, he did.
Yeah, the Kalamazoo.
Because he just wanted to.
You really can't go wrong if you said he played a keyboard instrument. Like if you any given keyboard, he might have had it at a time, you know, like he embraced many of them.
But he seemed to really embrace that Minimoog and keep that in his rig for a long time.
As many did. I mean, that it's probably one of
until the DX7.
Best-selling synths of all time, aside from the DX7.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he was an innovator in the synth world, even as he was in the jazz world. And with performance, I think the way that he incorporated, you know, dancers and singers, and I think he had like fire breathers, you know, sort of like a mix of like the Merry Pranksters and a circus act and, you know, a big band.
They would go out into the audience.
They would walk through the audience. Some people said that, you know, you at one point you might be surrounded by like all the saxophone players.
And they're just like, they're horning at you.
You're just going to lose your mind.
Yeah.
You just wanted to get you out of your box and reach for the unknown. I think the thing that sticks with me the most is that he talks about how the things we already know, the way we're already living, the known, we already are trapped in these known ways of existing. So the only thing left to do is to live in the unknown, to embrace the chaos, to embrace the darkness, right? We live on this tiny blue dot, right, in the middle of the vast expanding universe, the majority of which is darkness. Most of his songs reference this idea. And chaos, the chaos of the universe, the chaos of creation that's happening, right? Like things becoming, stars being born and dying, galaxies being born and dying. That the unknown is where our future lies, that embracing the unknown and letting go of the known, which he considered to be misery and suffering. He was like, I look around the world and all I see is misery and suffering. This is what is known. We're living in the known. Like, we need to embrace the unknown. And I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. And trying to embrace that.
And you mentioned darkness, and I just, when you were saying that, something came to mind. You know, if you think about it, space is dark.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. Yeah, like being able to see in the darkness, adjusting to the darkness, right? That takes, you know, letting go of your fear, right? If you enter the darkness and you're just afraid and you close your eyes, right? You'll never know what's there. You have to adjust. You have to adjust to it. And what's on the other side of that is even more unknown. So his philosophy is his poetry, his way of being. Like he embodied this myth that he talks about. He lived it. There was no discrepancy. There was no change. There was no like gotcha moments with Sun Ra. Like he was the real deal. He understood, he was educated about myth and how to use that to propagate these ideas that he had, right? Like storytelling is how you change people's minds. And that's what he was doing through music and through, you know,
the universal language.
The universal language. So, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg with Sun Ra. That's what we've been steeping ourselves in for these past few weeks. And we're going to continue sharing, you know, articles and videos and, you know, some of the things we referenced here in this episode in our Cosmic Tape Music Club group. Please join us there. We're going to put a link in the show notes so that you can join us in the group. We can get to know you. We can hear your stories about Sun Ra, and we can get into this, you know, get into the unknown together.
If you have an opportunity to check out the remaining members of the Arkestra, highly recommend it. We actually had the opportunity when they played the Kennedy Center with Solange in DC. It was amazing. So definitely.
Yeah. So after his passing, which we didn't, you know, to me, he lives on infinitely, so it doesn't really matter to me. But he did pass in 1993.
I guess I'm in denial of that.
Yeah. Whatever. He's transmolecularization into another form at this point. But the Arkestra continued to play on. John Gilmore took over for a little while. Then he passed in 95. And Marshall Allen has been leading the
Carrying
Arkestra
the torch
ever since. And he's still doing it. So, you know, if you get the chance, whenever that is possible again, definitely check it out.
He's the dude. Marshall Allen's the dude that everyone will recognize instantly when they
Yeah.
see, and they'll think of, oh yeah, I've seen this guy leading this band before. So, aside from Sun Ra, of course.
Yep. So, we also didn't mention June Tyson, which I'm really sad. I feel like we needed to do like a mini episode after this to talk about all the things we didn't talk about. But June Tyson was the singer. She was the only woman who also referred to herself as part of the angel race. She was not human. She was not woman. She was not male. She was angel. Her voice is from another realm for sure. So if you hear a woman's voice on the Sun Ra recordings, it is June Tyson, who passed in 92, I believe. Passed on to another realm. And
she died before him?
yeah,
Oh, wow.
just right around the same time, which is
Right.
really interesting because she was much younger. She did the costumes. She was also a dancer. She was 6 foot tall. She was just a presence. Her voice just weaves its way into my brain, and you just can't forget it. It changes you.
Her a cappella work is just breathtaking. Like, it's so good.
Her precision, her intervals, like
Yeah.
I've never heard anyone sing that way
And
with
just
such confidence.
Start
and
out in a beautiful place and end in a beautiful place. Like, just, you don't have to worry about it. It doesn't make you nervous.
yeah, yeah. She carries you to that other realm as well. Sort of like kind of that angel figure. But there's so many more, amazing musicians and artists that were part of the group that we didn't get to touch on, but there's so much more to explore. That's what we're saying. This is kind of the tip of the iceberg. This is an introduction. This is, us getting nerdy about the aspects we're interested in. But there's just so much.
And
There's so much to go through.
With a focus on Ra.
Yeah. Yeah. So, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Cosmic Tape Music Club. We're just so glad that, we get to do this. It inspires us. We hope it inspires you. And we will see you next time. See you in the group.
See you next time.